Cool, so good morning and welcome to the first Informing New Zealand Beef Breeders Forum. Thank you for taking time off farm to come and learn a bit more about our industry and breeding for the future. We have arranged for it to rain, so you're not wasting too much time that you could be out doing things. So Beef and Lamb New Zealand and Beef and Lamb New Zealand Genetics is proud to work on the Informing New Zealand Beef program on behalf of New Zealand farmers. It's a $16.7 million program a partnership between Beef and Lamb New Zealand, MPI, the New Zealand Meat Board and farmers. At Beef and Lamb, our vision is for sustainable and profitable farmers, thriving rural communities valued by farmers. Valued by New Zealanders. And this program is us really focusing on those things that are important to you as farmers. It's focusing on the profit, it's focusing on profitability and really adding money to your bottom line. How much? We think that there's $450 million available to New Zealand's beef farmers over the next 25 years if we get this program right. However, the success of the program will be determined by farmers, stud farmers, commercial farmers taking the opportunity that the program presents. So we've got opportunities like the new traits that are being developed for New Zealand conditions, the body condition scoring trait, for example, that Jason and the team are working on. Opportunities like the crossbreed analysis to nail down the value to be had from hybrid vigour, and also giving farmers the opportunity and ability to start comparing across breeds objectively. Opportunities like the genetic connection between studs from bulls used through progeny tests and commercial herd linkage. Opportunities like commercial farmers providing knowledge and information from their herds to flow back to the studs, increasing the accuracy of the decision making on the stud farms. Opportunities like the wider use of genomics to allow for the animal's worth and decisions to be made earlier in its life. Opportunity to leverage Improve, the sheep tool that we're using to put information in the hands of farmers and to use a common language for our farmers to understand their genetic merit and genetic decisions across the industry. And most importantly, or probably most importantly, extension and learning opportunities across the country for our commercial farmers and our breeders, including this beef forum, webinars, workshops, podcasts, field days, and many, many more things. As a quick example, in November we launched a Better Beef Breeding online module. Since then we've had 160 people use that, and the really pleasing thing from that is each user is using it for 18 minutes per time. We know that self-directed, self-paced learning is one of the most effective ways for adults to learn new information, so that's really pleasing that people are going there. Some of our modules, if we're honest, it's only 3 or 4 minutes that people spend on them, but people are investing a genuine amount of time in that workshop, so we're really getting some cut through there. At Beef and Lamb New Zealand, we're proud of the people we bring to work on these tough challenges. So the INZB program is built on having the best scientists and applied geneticists we can. People you know like Jason Archer, Anna Boyd and Craig Foote, and new people like Sonia Shaw, Dr. Gemma Jenkins, Dr. G. Kang and Dr. Franzi Vick. We've got input and advice from experts and world leaders, Dr. Peter Amer, Dr. Dorian Garrick, working alongside our breeders, our breed society, and crucially, of course, our farmers. We've got a really good agenda, we've got excellent speakers, we've got good topics, but we've also purposefully left a lot of time and the opportunity for a dinner and time on the buses tomorrow to spend time talking, collaborating, and getting to know, catching up with some old friends and maybe meeting some new people as well. So with that, we'll get underway. Although I would note, I'm just a tiny bit nervous. Last time I opened a conference like this one, right about this moment is when I was told that we had COVID in the room, and we had to cancel the whole shooting box and send everyone home, much to everyone's disappointment. And the last time I was in the room with this many breeders was at the World Hereford Congress, which became famous for all the wrong reasons. So if you've got a tickle in your throat, maybe just sit outside. Right, so welcome, thanks for coming, thanks for investing your time. We're really excited about this. We've been building for it for a couple of years, being delayed by COVID and everything else that's happened. So we're excited to have you here. Thank you for coming along, and we're looking forward to a good couple of days. Anna.
Thanks very much, Dan. So it is now my pleasure to introduce you all to Melissa Clark-Reynolds, who is our keynote speaker. Melissa was awarded the award of an Officer of the New Zealand Order of Merit in 2015 for services to the technology industry. Melissa is a futurist, a strategist and an entrepreneur, and has an extensive history working with the primary industry sector. And her main focus is sort of on the future of food and agriculture. And so with that in mind, Melissa is going to speak to us today about the tailwinds and headwinds that might be facing us as a beef sector. So may I please ask you to show a warm welcome to Melissa Clark-Reynolds.
Oh, well, good morning, everybody. I didn't realise what an upset that comment from Dan would be, because I was the first independent director on the Beef and Lamb Board, and my very first job actually was over in Wanganui at on a Saveloy line, and then I came here to Massey, but I ended up studying a mixture of epidemiology and environmental planning. And so I'm sitting on the Beef and Lamb Board saying, we shouldn't be sending anyone to this Hereford conference. And I remember being told there's no need to panic, and the kicker when you're a woman is deer. And so, I kind of hadn't thought about that until you mentioned it. And I remember just feeling really sick after this Beef and Lamb Board that we had decided against my kind of every bit of intuition in my body. And I had been working on the virus for a while at that point, so I work, just as a bit of background, I work with a number of large food producers in New Zealand, and also quite a few international logistics companies that move New Zealand product around, plus acknowledge Stu here. Stu and I are on the board of Atkins Ranch together, so not beef, obviously, lamb. But I've kind of been around the sector a long time. I worked for AFCO at various points, and I've worked for ANZCO, and I've worked for Alliance. So, but my real interest is in this kind of where are things coming, what's the future, what are the patterns of things. And we were in Scotland. You can kind of look at my heritage. You can see that, my whakapapa to the north. And if you've got any Scottish heritage, you're basically also Danish, because the Vikings occupied us for so long. And if we think about this, and there is a relevance here to the beef industry, is that my DNA has co-evolved with farm animals, if you think about that, right? So if you think about my ancestors way back when, the only way to keep warm in Scotland was actually to live in the barn, if that made sense, So when you think back to my whakapapa, we particularly coexisted with sheep and beef, a little less with pigs up there in the north, but with sheep and beef. And that DNA evolved over time so that we ended up with a lot of what's called epigenetics. So we ended up with a lot of resistance to quite a lot of farm animal diseases in our DNA. So I'm up in Scotland at Hogmanay in 2019 with my family, and I'm on my phone, and I'm getting these elbows all the time. Mum, get off your phone. And I go, no, something's going down, I need to keep an eye on this. And of course what we'd had was that in December we'd had the first reports start to trickle out of China that there was a new flu-type virus. And one of the things I do is I keep an eye on what are called novel zoonoses. So I'd been working on M. bovis, I'd been keeping an eye on avian flu for quite a few years. And there was a little bit of me that kind of went, as soon as we started to hear about doctors going to jail, I'm like, game on, there is something serious here. Does that make sense? You don't have to be a medical or mathematical genius to kind of work out that if doctors are going to jail in China, they've probably told the truth. Does that make sense? And so I'm going, look, these doctors have gone to jail. At that point, there were only 19 people that had this virus. But what I was also really concerned about as someone from the food industry is I was really concerned that this was something that had emerged from the food industry. And if we think about it, so in 1989 I did a course in climate medicine, and I was basically drilled into us that from 2020 onwards we should be calling this pandemic century. And the two things that would call this pandemic century, the two causes, one would be that we were changing the habitat around the planet that insects that carry disease would be happy in. And so in 1990 I wrote a report for the Ministry for the Environment that said in 2021 Nelson will be underwater and we'll have an outbreak of dengue fever. Now I was half right, right? And the reason I thought it would be dengue fever would be because I thought that the mosquitoes would love how warm and wet it was going to be in Nelson, and we'd have an outbreak. And then the second one that we were really concerned about is the expansion of animal agriculture into rainforest. And if you think about the expansion of animal agriculture into rainforest, that's happened in Indonesia, it's happening in China, it's happening in South America. And so what you get, and this is the long story back to my whakapapa, is that you get mammals into areas where they've never previously hung out together. So there's no natural habitat in which a human, a bat and a pangolin coexist. And so you put that together in a marketplace in China, or you move beef into those areas, or you move other things. And we're seeing it all over the world at the moment. I'm constantly monitoring these diseases that might be coming into mammals from exposure to monkeys, which we never coexisted before, or so on. So, I know that's a bit depressing, and it wasn't really what I was going to start my talk with. But one of the things I would kind of put away in the back of your mind, so there we were, December 2019, 31st of December, I'm like on my phone. On the 23rd of January 2020, the first genomic analysis came out of the virus that showed this relationship between the bat, the pangolin, and the human, and how it had come through. And other than you lot who talk about genomics every day, you can imagine I'm getting really excited and telling my family about this genomic analysis and where it's come from. And in those days, people didn't really know what an epidemiologist did, let alone get excited about genomics. And now I find that we sit around the kitchen table, talking about the new strains and the new variants and, where are the genomic analyses. But that just wasn't in our conversation. So that was the 23rd of January, and at that point I sent a few emails out to my clients going, heads up, there's something really going down here. And then on the 7th of February, two things happened. The first of those doctors died, and China ran out of shipping containers. And that was when I was like, holy hell, it's absolute game on. It took us a while as a country, a little bit longer to kind of catch up with that. And I think what happens sometimes is it feels like that's way over there. But probably one of the things I want you to think about, and you will have noticed, and Sarah and I are talking about it today in a way, is that globalisation has really accelerated in the last sort of 10 years, and our ability to travel places, and I know that got really constrained for kind of 3 years, but our ability to move people around the planet so fast is also one of the reasons that this virus managed to move so quickly. Right, and if you think about just Australia and New Zealand, if it's only a 3-hour flight, somebody gets on that flight and they're sick, they may not probably know till they've been here for a couple of days. And so this kind of, what are our patterns? I think you have to accept that the disruption that we've seen in these last 3 years, this is not a one-off. Now, we may not respond the same ways, and we may or may not decide that it's okay we may decide that lockdowns aren't okay and that it's okay for us to endure more deaths or whatever. We only had 30 people die last week, which is doing pretty well compared to how we've been going lately. But it's interesting to me how we've sort of stopped talking about the pandemic, like we've just moved on now. And I do think the World Health Organization announcement this week to kind of go, hey, look, we're done, is the right one. But at the same time, we are still living with COVID. And living with COVID does still mean somewhere between 40 and 50 New Zealanders dying a week. So it didn't mean to be so cheerful, but I guess what it does is it leads into what do I do for my day job. So I have been watching Japanese encephalitis just while we're being cheerful, which is in Australia, and I think we're now up to about 11 dead on that. Don't think it's coming here, not too worried about it. Avian flu does worry me, not so much for the beef industry, but it is decimating wild flocks around the world now. It's been a pandemic now for 4 years. And as we've learnt with the COVID virus, we know that new variants come. The less you manage a virus, the more variants it creates. Over time, it may or may not become less virulent, so it will often become worse before it becomes better. And so with avian flu, we're seeing quite an impact on this. Now, what is the silver lining of that for you lot? Is that you may remember, like, the biggest pandemic to affect our sector actually was African swine flu. I don't know if you remember, so we had these massive culls globally of pork. And what that did is it really opened up for sheep and beef meat to even accelerate further their exports into China. And so there is quite a close relationship between some of these pandemics and our opportunities or challenges. And so I guess what I'm saying is, you might be paying a lot for your eggs now, but trust me, the price of eggs is going up globally, and it's going up everywhere. And here it's been a change in regulation, but globally there are two big things. The war in Ukraine has pushed the price of grain through the roof for chicken producers, but the impact of avian flu we can't take away either. And so I'm constantly watching that to go, was this an opportunity again for red meat? Because you may know that chicken and pork are actually the most eaten proteins in the world now. So, somebody else's misfortune sometimes is our opportunity. So what I do on a daily basis as a futurist is I play with these four sectors. And I'm interested in those mega trends, which we also call drivers of change. The really big kind of things that are happening globally. Might be climate change, it might be the digitization of things, it might be big, we've saw globalization for a long time, and we've really seen the rise of nationalism in a lot of countries as a reaction. We've seen this whole, what I call the rise of the feminine, where you see things like, it's schoolgirls that have started the revolution in Iran this time. Or you see that there were a number of liberal economies, us included, that had female young prime ministers for a while. And then what you also get is the big reaction against that. And so you see countries where the opposite has happened, where they've kind of fought back for male power. I want you to hear, I'm not saying this is good or bad. I'm just saying that these swings happen, and you often will get an action and a reaction. So globalization versus nationalism, climate change, denial, whatever it is, lockdowns, a fight for freedom. These things, one of the things I like to say to people is that the present is messy and contradictory, and the future will be too. And what we often want is we want to be told that there's a single future out there and it's going to be like this. But when we look around, the present is already pretty messy. And so there isn't going to be one future. I'm not that interested in trends, and those are the things that might be fashionable for a while and kind of come and go. By the time something's a trend, it's not much use to my customers. But these mega trends are, on the left there, those wild cards are the kind of random stuff that we know is coming, but they're not on a regular cycle. And so they can be quite hard to predict. And I didn't used to have falling rockets on my list, but I do now. So, these kinds of random things, it's almost like throwing the joker in and seeing what you get. Down the bottom is the thing that I'm probably most interested in, and this is this whole idea of what are the weak signals. What are the early things that we might be looking at that might turn into something bigger later? And I'm going to talk to you about a few of those drivers of change and a few of those signals. And then the other thing I'd say is that I have to keep reminding myself of this, that there are no future facts. And what I mean by that is that there's a bunch of research that's been done on futurists, and it finds that the more you know about a topic, the worse you are at predicting the future of it, which is a bit of a grim thing when I set myself up as a futurist in food and ag, right? So I'm not saying ignore everything I say, but I also kind of would say, like, when someone feels very certain about the future, take that with a big grain of salt. I think the thing about it is that we're still creating the future as we go. So it's not like there's a predetermined future. I don't believe in fate. I do certainly believe that we have a real ability to shape the future that we go into, but it's also really important to understand that there are forces outside of us that might derail some of our plans or might accelerate some of our plans. So the kind of signals I'm interested in is I'm a bit obsessive about taking photos of things. Who knew kind of 20 years ago that I'd be wandering around taking photos of plants and food and putting it on the internet? It just seems ridiculous, right? But the thing about a signal, it's not a hunch, it's not a trend, it's an actual specific thing, like an event or a moment in time, that I'm really interested in. So I've just recently been in the UK, and one of the things that struck me was that everywhere you looked, there were products with CBD in it at the dairy. So CBD is the non-THC bit of cannabis. And it just kind of shocked me. So this was just sitting at eye height where the kids are, and I had my grandchildren at the dairy and they're like, chocolate, chocolate. I'm like, yeah, I'm not buying you cannabis chocolate. But you know, you can see it was just in everything. We saw CBD cakes, we saw CBD tea, and it was something I had seen a few years ago as a very weak signal, but it's kind of now, I was just shocked at how it was in everything, and it's all over the counter, CBD sleep stuff, CBD gummies, just everywhere. And then on the other side, one of the things that I'd been seeing for a while were these like vegan menus with labelled as meat, in a sense, do you see what I mean? So that this was a burger place that I walked past in East London, and it's a chain, and all of the wording on them as if it's chicken or something, and I had to go in and actually have a look and check. And it wasn't, you know, they weren't trying to sell something that was like beef, but I found it really interesting that they obviously have enough of a market, and the place was constantly full. And so what we've seen is we've seen this rise of vegan food. And I want to talk about this just very tiny bit, which is that we haven't actually seen much of an increase of people becoming vegans. But we have seen hundreds of % increase in the sale of vegan food. So do you get, like, people are deeply contradictory, okay? That's like, anyone here who's married will know this, right? So people are contradictory. And so what we've seen is that the growth of vegan food purchases has largely come from meat eaters. It hasn't come from vegetarians converting to veganism, and it hasn't actually come from meat eaters becoming vegans. What it's come from is meat eaters who want to reduce their meat consumption. Do you get that? And most of the marketing of vegan food is marketed as what we call flexitarian marketing. So it's aimed at meat eaters who feel guilty about the planet or feel guilty about their cholesterol or their fat intake or whatever it is. And I think this is really interesting because it's both a threat and an opportunity. To me, the threat in it is that if we try to fight the vegans, you know, you're on a losing proposition, right? But what there really is an opportunity here is if people are thinking, and it's not all of the market, but the market with discretionary income, if they're thinking about reducing their meat consumption, then they're willing to pay more for their meat when they do buy it because they think about it being a treat that they're going to have 3 times a week. Do you get that? So you can take away a bunch of their guilt too as we think about how we farm and their climate concerns. And I do think in New Zealand we can really do that with an authentic approach, and it's not something that everybody can do. So I want to talk about, like, change happens what we call slowly, 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 and then suddenly. And so this is a photo from New York City in 1905. It's Easter, and that little circle that I have here is the idiot who bought a car, okay? And I don't know what it's like in your community, but the community I live in, people can have a bit of an opinion about how everybody else does their stuff. And so there was a lot of opinion about this guy buying this car. And they mocked him quite hard. And he was mocked in the New York Times, and he was mocked by his neighbours because, of course, he had to send a horse and cart down to the dock to pick up the petrol to put in this car. So you couldn't actually own a car back then without also having a horse and cart to be able to manage what you needed. And I went back and I looked at the New York Times at the era, and there was a lot of hand-wringing about job losses, about how if the car took over, all of those people, and you can see like every single one of those carts has got a driver, and that they would be out of business. What they also had was a good chunk of Manhattan was still farmland, and there were people who would like drive in, farmers every morning with their hay to feed the horses, and there was real concern that the farmers would go broke if the car took over. There was huge concern about the farriers, about the stable hands. A lot of the bottom floor of housing in Manhattan had a stable in it. And so you look at it, and what's really interesting to me is that this is basically a major technological change. And when we're faced with major technological changes, we generally think they're going to be negative. Do you get this? But I don't know that any of us would swap our cars. I mean, I'm glad I drove up here in a really nice car this morning. I didn't want to have brought a horse and cart from Wellington, right? And so what's interesting too is that research of new technologies has consistently shown that there's a small dip in employment followed by a massive increase. which is really interesting because, of course, when you're sitting in this world, you can't see that there's an increase in jobs for mechanics, for road engineers, for the people putting in the petrol stations and so on, all of the, people making traffic lights and the people who clean cars and on and on and on. And so I think one of the things I like to think about here is that this looked like a major disruption and people were very concerned about it. But when we look back in history, it only took them 8 years for this to happen in New York. And we think we live in a time of really fast change. But what I would say is that there have been a number of technologies in our past. If we think about the loom and we think about the whole industrial revolution, it wasn't fun for a lot of people. I want to be super clear here. There was massive turbulence in the economy. There was massive disruption of jobs. The same with the introduction of the car. I bet there was the same angst around the first sort of Massey Ferguson tractors and so on. So it's human nature that we get anxious about this tech, but it's also fascinating that so far all of the evidence shows an increase in employment after that new technology is deployed. So I just want to talk very briefly about electric cars, and I know that you're thinking, hang on a minute, I came to a beef breeder event, but this is a big change that's occurring. So in the 1800s, there were more electric vehicles in production than there were the internal combustion engine, and the technology just didn't win. And I think it's a kind of a fascinating thing is that there can be technologies that end up almost like in eddies, and they kind of stall for a while and then they come back. So what we're seeing is just this huge acceleration globally in the production of electric vehicles. But the thing I think you should be kind of interested in here is part of why this is occurring is that there's just this major shift going on of where the dominant economy is and also who the big companies are. So if you think about the old days, companies used to make hardware and then they'd get software to run their hardware. Do you see what I'm getting at? And cars, for a long time, the way they've evolved is that you had hardware companies, in a sense, like the car companies, who then put lots of software, more and more and more software into their cars. What we're seeing in the electric vehicle business is we're seeing software companies that are wrapping some hardware around their software. And that's a massive shift. And when we look at these numbers, I know they're tiny up there, but basically VW is about the only one of the traditional car companies that's making the transition as fast as these new software-driven cars. And then if we think globally, you'll probably all think Tesla if I say what's the best-selling brand, but actually might have the best-selling car, but the best-selling brand is a BYD. And if you haven't driven one, they're ridiculously fun. They're kind of a bit different than the way that a regular kind of car drives, but they're really surprising. And so this is a Chinese brand, and when we look here, we're likely just to see this massive increase of Chinese car company brands, and it's because they've seen themselves as tech software companies first. And I think this is interesting as I start to sort of think about, like, how does that play out in other sectors? Where our hardware versus our software plays? You probably heard that old comment from Bill Gates years ago that software is eating the world. And for me, this is a really good example of it. And so, I know some of us, we like to kind of keep with our old tech and we like to do it that way. But we are at a point now where pretty much everything we do in every part of our lives has a software component to it. And that includes cars. The first cars now on the MG on the New Zealand market will do over 500 Ks on a charge. It's still, this is not an ad for them, it's under 70,000 to buy it. These price dynamics are going to change the market very, very quickly. So China, I know I've sort of been quite bullish on China, but China is actually about to go into decline. So this is an interesting thing that we think about it. And the reason that China is going into decline is that just sheer force of numbers, the growth of the Chinese middle class has meant that they've been a fantastic market for our meat. And as people get richer, they eat more meat to a certain extent, and then they realise we're getting all the diseases of meat eaters, and they sort of decline very slightly. But there's been such a big middle class in China that has driven this massive consumption and desire for animal protein in a way that they haven't had for the last, well, probably forever. But interestingly, thanks to that one-child policy, they're now reached peak population, and they're in decline, and what's coming up behind them is India. So I'm talking 10-year plan, I'm not talking like the next 2 or 3 years, but I'm really interested in what that means in terms of the dynamics, and you can see we've got quite a lot of geopolitical uncertainty between China and the US at the moment, and I think that will continue to play out. So I'm not as kind of bullish, I didn't mean to pun, but I'm not as bullish about the Chinese market long term as I probably was 3 or 4 years ago, when I was encouraging everybody just to absolutely crank their product through there. So India is not as much of a beef eating country as China was, but we don't know, they may well change as they become richer and the dynamics change there. There may be some changes in their eating habits, but I'd be keeping a good eye on that. I think too, we've seen a whole lot of new technology come into food production. So, vertical farming, I think that it is definitely going to disrupt outdoor vegetable production. So not such an issue for you, but I do have some real concerns long term about New Zealand's ability to create export lettuce and so on. But the reason that these vertical farms are working now when they didn't work 3 or 4 years ago is that synergy with the power that it was just there. So we've seen this massive reduction, I'm about to show you a slide on it, in the cost of producing electricity. And what that does is it makes indoor vegetable farming much more viable than it's ever been before. We're also seeing a lot of disruption in the milk industry, and I'm picking more disruption in milk than I am in meat. And I've just finished a Dairy NZ roadshow, and partly why is that it's much easier to take carbohydrates, say sugarcane or something, put it into a vat with some microbes and just make what you want. Just make casein, or just make whey, or just make lactoferrin. That's at a point now where it's commercialised in Singapore, the technology is working really well, and it's commercialisable. Much, much harder. I know there's been a lot of hype around the kind of lab-grown meat, but if you think about it, sorry for the vegetarians in the room, but I had this really beautiful sirloin steak the other night for dinner, and I found myself looking at it thinking, how hard is it to grow this in a lab, right? To grow the different muscle texture, the fat, the rippling of the fat, the exterior cap, like all of that stuff. Meat is just a much, much harder proposition to grow in a lab, and whereas being able to go, I'm just making casein or I'm just making whey, that is a much easier thing and is already commercialised, and the price of the production of that is plummeting. So I'm a little concerned. This is again 10-year horizon, not 2-year horizon, but I have some concern about the ingredients market. So I used to say it a lot more softly, and I'm getting more and more convinced as time goes on. So this idea of what's happening with energy production is that the price of energy has almost come to zero. And I think that's worth thinking about for a long term. So what we see now is that globally the price of installing wind or solar and running that wind or solar is cheaper than just running coal or nuclear. Do you get that? So the price of creating it, building a solar installation or building a wind installation, and the running costs combined is cheaper than the running costs of either coal or nuclear. And so we're seeing, for a long time, we saw subsidies on coal in the US. That was to prop up their balance sheets. And we've seen under the Biden administration the reduction of those. And so we're going to see a big increase in coal price. This is finally driving the decarbonisation of our food industry in New Zealand. So we use a lot of coal, whether it's in tomato production or drying, kiln drying forestry, or drying milk. So there's some energy dynamics that will come in that I think that the meat sector in a way is a little protected from, but again is going to impact on dairy. Then of course, Atkins Ranch, our farms, our suppliers are from Gisborne down to Masterton, so they bore the brunt of the last lot of rain. I wasn't expecting to be here. Well, I was phoning friends this morning to see how their farms were. Friends in the top of the south are well underwater, around Mapua and around Upper Moutere and so on. And of course in the far north we're underwater again. It's the second 50-year flood in 6 weeks or something. So we have to accept that these are the new normal. And that makes us think too about where we're producing beef and how. And there will be some land use changes come, and I'm definitely not in favour of covering the country in pine. I want to be super clear about that. But there will be more and more discussion about where do we farm and how do we farm and what's the right way to farm. Changing very slightly is that the subscription business model has been around now for about 20 years, and I think this has changed a lot of things. So if you think about, I was listening to Spotify on the way up in the car. I used to go on a Saturday morning with a mate and we'd buy a book and a CD and after our coffee, and now, we almost never do either. And I still read a lot of books, or I listen to a lot of books, but I don't buy them the way I used to. John Deere in 2016 said that they no longer wanted to sell any farm equipment. It's taken them a while for that transition to occur, but they're moving everything they can to as a service. So they've mapped all of US farmland, and they can pretty much run reaping, sowing, tilling, whatever you want from Missoula, Montana. They're the biggest investor in autonomous tech in the world, and they've done some real changes to the way they're thinking about their business model. So these sort of subscription models are really driving things, and I would be thinking in every business, I haven't found a business yet, which would include yours, that a subscription type model wouldn't work. 2016 was the year that humans lost the internet, and so what I mean by this is that in 2016 it was the last year that our traffic kind of approximated bot traffic. And what I mean by that, and I know Sarah will talk about a bunch of stuff later today, she's largely talking about more cell technology, but internet technology. If you think about your Fitbits talking to your scales, or we think about what's talking on a Wi-Fi, or there's this huge amount now of traffic on the internet that occurs, API calls that occurs like without a human intervention now. And that's only increasing. And so if we think about this Internet of Things, so sensors, EIDs, all of this equipment now has got to a point where it's really economically viable. But that was the tipping point, was back in 2016. And so some of you might have seen this slide before, but I just love it. It's this progression. Often when we see early kit, it's kind of like, oh, that's a bit shit. Like, so I saw this fridge magnet on my parents' washing machine, and up the top there, Tide is the best-selling American brand of laundry detergent. And back in 2016, if you pushed that button, a box of laundry detergent appeared in your Amazon shopping cart. And I'm like, oh, that's kind of vaguely interesting. Where's it going to go? And then Amazon tested a fridge scanner, so you could scan things in your kitchen and it would drop into your Amazon shopping cart. And then Amazon and Samsung launched a fridge that has a whole lot of cameras in it. And what happens is it scans the barcode in, scans the barcode out. If you don't put it in again, it drops it into your Amazon shopping cart. Now, obviously not possible here, but what it does is it kind of uses this Internet of Things to turn butter or something into a subscription. So you could imagine you could just have your lamb chops like arrive. Every time you used one up, another one turns up, right? Or beef. And then the final one was this oven that we looked at. We've just done a new kitchen, and I didn't buy it in the end, but a lot of us have got Wi-Fi ovens that you can set and turn on from the airport or wherever. But this one reads the recipe, so there's no kind of, if you want to roast or something, you can like turn the oven on. It'll know how long to do it at different temperatures. Or if you put the PAV in or whatever, it will turn it up, turn it down, all of that kind of thing. Without me having to program it, it reads the recipe. And so I can see a time where what we've got is the oven and the fridge like conspiring together to come up with a recipe and a shopping list, right? What I dread is when it also links to my scales and, it's got facial recognition and it goes, Mel, step away from the chocolate, and I then want to punch the fridge. But that kind of, you can see how there's more of that coming, and that also speaks to some of how we market our food and what channels our food ends up going in. I want to just quickly talk about this. What is that? Can someone tell me what that is there on your left? What is that? What is it? Ice cubes. Okay, there was court action threatened when that came into home production. Do you want to know why? Because the guys on the right, that's ice. And they fought really hard in the US courts to have that one on the left be called artificial ice. I hope you laugh, because when I talk to so many people in the sector, when we think about like that created or precision fermented, we try to get people to say, oh, you can't call oat milk milk, it's not really milk, you can't milk an oat. Do you get where I'm going here? And yet what happens over time is that there is no way, as my husband's making a martini or something, I'm going to go, honey, could you get the artificial ice? Do you get that? It's just ice. And I can see that the same thing is going to happen with, if we do get to that precision-made meat, or if we, as we get to milk, the consumer is not going to see the difference in terms of the word meat or milk. So we have to think about not defending the word, we have to think about what attributes we put on the real thing that means that it is of a higher value than whatever it is. Do you see, than the competition? And so here, they kind of, the big proposition, I guess, for the lab-grown stuff is that there's a lot of wastage. And you'll know this, we're always looking for where's the best market for our bones and our skins, and can we sell the tails, and where's the gelatin market, and so on. And so over time, I don't believe that people are going to distinguish between what they get from Bostocks and what they get from lab-grown in terms of the word chicken. But I do really believe that there will be a value on heritage, and there will be a value on like openly grown, outdoor grown, all of that taste and flavour. Do you see where I'm going here? But I don't believe that the language is going to be any different. And so this idea of carbs in, protein out is where the language in the synthetic meat industry is going. So what they're talking about is you can either put kind of carbs into a cow and get protein out, or you could put carbs into a vat and get protein out. Now, I'm not agreeing with that. I just want you to hear, though, that that is coming, and I don't think there's any value in us trying to stop it or fight it. What I think there's real value in us doing is thinking about how do we creatively play differently in order to carve out a premium place for us, which we already have. And so interesting to me is that Australia, because of climate change and because of the limits to where they can farm and how, because of what's happening to the climate there, they're investing heavily in the sugarcane production, which is the input into the alternate proteins. I don't think that's necessarily a good idea for us, but I think it's interesting because these things come together, right? Talking about climate change, we talk about the way that it might change where and how we can farm and what breeds we might need and what forage we're able to grow. And then I think it's interesting, Mosa Meats, that they describe these people as farmers and they're all what we might think of as bioengineers. And so, it's not just the word meat that's changing, maybe the word farmer changes as well. And I know, it gives me a slightly icky feeling. I can see some of you kind of going, oh, I don't really want this future, right? I feel the same. But I think sometimes we sort of have to look at it in order to be able to think about what might happen next. I played with AI to try and get these pictures, but I don't know if you know much about AI at the moment, despite all the hype, and I've been working on AI since 1986, so it's still, what it basically does is it searches everything we already know and then bodges that together. It can't create something new. So I really struggled to kind of think about meat in space. But we won't be taking cows to Mars if Musk does go. What they will be doing, though, is that there's a bunch of these little microbes that can convert CO2 into protein. And this has already been commercialised, particularly up in the Nordic states, where they discovered in the forests up there these little microbes that don't need genetic modification that do literally eat CO2. And so this kind of but my grandmother used to call this colour baby ship brown. So they are making this brown protein out of CO2. And I'm watching this because I feel like this is far more commercialisable than the lab-grown meat. But I think, again, where this starts to compete against is it starts to compete against whey protein. So for me, there's still this kind of uncertainty down the track around some of the dairy sector. Where am I seeing the best prices for beef anywhere in the world? I'm seeing claims-based beef get the best prices. And what's interesting here is it's not one claim. What I'm calling it is claim stacking. So I've done quite a bit of research into, do you get a better price for regen, or do you get a better price for antibiotic-free, or what do you get a better price for? And what we're finding is it's the stacking. It's you need at least 3 of these attributes. And it doesn't necessarily seem to matter which attributes they are. I forgot GAP up there, so animal welfare. But what we're seeing is that you need roughly 3 of these attributes in order to get a good premium in the market. When I went hunting for who had the highest price non-Wagyu beef, this company, Palmar in France, sorry for those of you who don't speak French, but I think what's really interesting is they really pump the genetics on the front page of their website. So you can see that word génétique is genetics, and they both do their own beef, and they only kill 4 animals a week. And they also have their own restaurant, but they supply other restaurants. But the 2 big claims that they make around their meat is the genetics that it has, and then the flavour. And so they're selling a prime rib at $1,000. I haven't seen anywhere else. That's raw, so I haven't seen anywhere else that's getting that kind of price. But what I like about it is it's all natural in that sense, they're not trying to, they're arguing on genetics and taste. We've talked quite a bit. I know a number of you will have, I had conversations with people earlier today. I kind of often used to think about the meat industry and the dairy industry separately. The more I go out and I talk to normal humans who are not involved in farming, they don't know that there's any difference. Farming is farming to them. And we've got some social license issues for the whole sector, regardless of whether we're in the meat industry or whether we're in the dairy industry. And I think this is important for us to think about. The world out there doesn't see us separately. And so one of the big issues that you will know that dairy has is bobby calves, and that issue is only going to get bigger as social media continues and people continue to understand the issue. So, we kind of do have to think as a meat industry, how are we going to help dairy out? And I know there's a lot of issues around, the size of animals that come off dairy cross. And so I want you to hear here, I'm not saying, gosh, dairy cross is going to save the world. I want to be super clear here. But I also want to think about social license, is that most people don't distinguish between sheep and beef farming and dairy. They just think farming, and we have to think as a whole in New Zealand how we solve some of these problems. And also what I think we need to be thinking about as a result of that is the veal industry. And I know it's brutal. Like, I grew up eating veal, and New Zealanders just don't. And I doubt that we can convert New Zealanders to veal. I think to start a new category like that here is quite hard going. But we do want to be thinking about where we might have export markets for veal and if we can make it economic. And so again, I'm not saying you should. I'm just saying that, as a whole, we have an issue in the sector with bobbies, and we need to be thinking a bit more about how we can get a premium product for those. Every beef industry is looking at this. Irish, Canadian, Scottish, doesn't really matter. They all see that this is an issue. People don't like us killing like babies, So the other one I'd say is that the IMF debate is just growing, or the IMF conversation is growing and growing. I think we can think about a lot of these other attributes, but flavour is still, the reason I chose that sirloin steak the other day is because I knew it would taste really good, And when you survey customers, they'll talk about nutrition and things, but we know that people are not that concerned about nutrition in real life. Because otherwise I'd be a lot skinnier. We eat with our eyes first. We think about the sort of rationalisation around calories or around whatever it is later. But I just would really say that this push around IMF, we need to be really thinking, if we want to distinguish ourselves from the kind of alternatives and we want to go down a premium, that eating quality is absolutely essential. and how it tastes. I don't just mean IMF, but what is the flavour of this meat? What is the flavour of this production process? Can we find a way to premiumise the particular breeds that we're doing, or to build a story around why they're different, particularly if there is a climate story that is a good one to tell. So I want to kind of make a plea for hedonism. I just think that we're creating a product that should be pleasurable in terms of when it's eaten. And so if we're making this kind of plea for hedonism, how do we really think, along with all of the growth and production values of the animal, how are we really thinking about that eating quality? Because that's the difference with those French guys who are getting their $1,000 for a rib, is because the eating quality is absolutely unsurpassed, and they've got a fantastic story to tell with it. So, I've talked a lot about the 10-year horizon. I think what often happens is that the next 2 years we think there'll be lots of change, and I don't know that there will be that much change in the next 2 years, except that we're going to see more and more of these flood events. But in the next 10, I think we're in for quite a big ride. I'm very positive about the beef industry. I want to be super clear here. I'm positive about the meat industry in general. I do think we're going to see this rise of flexitarians, and that rise will continue. We've been talking about them for about 5 years. There will be large chunks of the premium end of the market, which is the market that we want to sell our meat to, who will continue to reduce their consumption. But because they're reducing their consumption doesn't mean they'll reduce their spend. And I think that's an important one to think about. That, to me, I've always been much more interested in how much profit do we make than how much revenue do we make. And so what we want to be really thinking about over and over are what are the qualities that our consumers want from us. So they want to hear that we're doing something good about climate. They want to hear that our animals have been treated well during their whole life. And it's rough when you're in the meat industry, right? I kind of go happy, 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 oops, dead. Or you kind of go, there's the one bad day story. But what I think we need to be thinking about here is, can they live fulfilling natural lives for as much of their lives as possible? These discussions, and with the transparency that comes from social media, they're only going to become more and more discussion items. But let's not forget that food is really fun. Let's not forget that it should be about pleasure and delight. And I want to leave you with these questions. I know you probably want to ask me a few questions, and I've got time for a few, but this idea at the moment is that I think that this turbulence that we're in, we need to be really having some good discussions about things like, what does heritage mean? How do our neighbours see us? Can we be thinking about what attributes we can really double down on as a sector, and think about how we continue to look for that premium end of the market? Remember what I was saying about stacking of attributes. It's not one attribute. You have to stack multiple together. So IMF plus animal welfare plus regen, or IMF plus ABO plus GMO free, or whatever it is, that you need to be thinking, what are like 3 or 4 of these attributes I can stack together? And one of those ones to me ought to be more of a discussion about heritage breeds and about our farming techniques, and how those heritage breeds and those farming techniques lead through into a really great taste experience. Thank you. I've got time for a few, haven't I?
Yeah, absolutely.
Good.
Thanks so much, Melissa.
That's right.
We do have the opportunity now to take some questions.
Or argue with me. I like that too.
Throw some different ideas out at Melissa. We've got a couple of questions, I believe, sitting on Slido, but if anyone would like to ask a question, raise your hand and we can get a microphone to you.
Kind of just stunned you. Yeah. Well, what's in Slido?
Excellent.
Oh, you've got one, Dan? Oh, great. Go. Yeah.
So my question, in 10 years, saying with what you've said around the dairy industry, what's your crystal ball for how big the dairy industry is in 10 years? Talking about that, that tipping point that you mentioned earlier on, compared to how big it is now.
Yeah, I actually haven't sat down and done the work on what I think the projection is, but I think there are a number of headwinds. So there's some headwinds in terms of if you disrupt the ingredients market, then you've got to work out what price you get for the rest of the milk. And I think there's some big headwinds in 10 years in the infant formula business as well. So what I didn't talk about is that the ability now to take that carbohydrate, put it in a vat and make bioidentical human milk is now at a point where that's pretty stable. It's not commercialisable, but within 10 years, obviously I'm way too old, but if I had to make a choice between do I want to buy infant formula, which is fundamentally a processed food, right? So infant formula made from cow's milk with palm oil in it and a bunch of additives, do I want that? Or do I want to buy formula over here that is bioidentical to human milk? Now, it's not going to have all of the immune factors that human milk has because, breast is best, obviously, and a mother makes the milk in demand to a baby's immune needs. But this one is just going to be the one that is pushed as healthy because it is more like human milk than we'll ever be able to make cow's milk. So I'd say that the turbulence that's coming at that plus the need to reduce our methane exposure is I can't see any option but destocking. Now, I don't think destocking's a terrible thing, and when we think about beef and lamb, we have destocked and raised our incomes. And I think that's the way we need to be thinking about it, is we shouldn't be thinking that destocking means a reduction in profit, and that's why I'm interested in profit. So we've seen it in the meat industry, right? We've done massive destocking since I was a kid. And out of that, we haven't actually seen a drop in income. So I know it's so I think we're going to see at least down to 80%, but it may well be half of the numbers that we have now. But I'm not ready to absolutely put my finger on a number. But I just can't see that we can continue at the levels we are. But we should be able to make more money. I think that's the other side of it, is that often I think we hear destocking means a reduction of income to the farmer, and I don't think those two have to go hand in hand, particularly if we think about breeding and other attributes. Yeah, great.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Melissa. We'll just...
There's one over there.
Yeah, while we're getting the microphone there, we'll just quickly jump to the Slido question.
Okay.
So we've got, how do you see a subscription model working for the beef industry?
So a few things, I suppose, is that... what if I did a 5 or 10 year deal with you and I paid you the same amount every month and you kept me up with the best genetics? Do you see what I mean? Like rather than one-off sales of things. But what I'm actually doing, if you think about, I pay for my phone. Theoretically, my phone subscription means that I've always got phone coverage. I know it doesn't always work that way. But what if we thought about the relationship slightly differently, which is that I have a long-term relationship with you as a breeder, and I pay you every month, and you keep me in the best genetics possible for what I'm trying to achieve with my herd. Does that make sense? And it's a different kind of relationship.
Excellent, thank you. We'll just go to that next Slido question and then we'll come back to you with the microphone. So where has the labour force gone? And are they all shifting road cones? And are they coming back? And when?
Was that from you, Stu? Oh, my God. I just know that the meat industry, one of the meat companies we're involved with, I was in a board meeting a few months ago and the chairman said something like, you get more money shifting road cones. What you have to remember with New Zealand is that we are at the highest employment we have ever had since we started keeping records. So what that basically means is that every New Zealander who is either capable of working or who wants a job has one, which we've never been in that situation before, certainly in my lifetime anyway. And so what that means is that we need to think a lot more about our working conditions than probably ever before. So if we have to think about retention, because the only way that anybody else in the room is getting staff is nicking them off you guys, then you have to really think about much more than we probably have before in our sector. What is it to be a really good employer? How do we train and retain these people? So people need to know that they've got a career path. And I did a big project recently for Mukatangata, which is the Workforce Development Council for the primary sector. And what came through loud and clear from particularly young people in the sector was that they felt a bit disillusioned that they couldn't see a path between coming in as a 17 or 18-year-old and either a path to ownership or a path to becoming a farm manager, or they were just worried that they might get stuck in their job for too long. And I really took that on in terms of thinking about it. So we have to be thinking a lot more about how we're keeping and developing our people. Whereas when we had more unemployment, we could kind of say, you know what, your job is to train yourselves. You go to Massey, get a qualification, or you go to Taratahi or whatever it is on your dollar. But in full employment, we have to think about that training relationship differently. And then finally, I think there are some big headwinds that come from saying, you know what, the only way to solve our sector's problem is to bring in more immigration. Because there are basically only two places that immigration comes from. It comes from India and it comes from China. And integrating those into our communities, we have to actually do a whole lot of work. Now, I want you to be clear here, I'm not against that. But I think we haven't necessarily thought about what it is to be, you know, perhaps the only Chinese family in a rural community, or one of two Indian families, or so on. And so we have to think a bit differently about, it's all very well to say, yep, we just need more RSE workers or we need more immigration. We really need to think about how we awhi them and manaki them into our communities. So I don't really have an answer there, but I think one of the things to remember is this one, we are at full employment. We've never been here before. We don't have a map. Yes?
Yeah, I'd like to ask you a little bit about the extent to which, by the way, Lockwood Smith's my name, the extent to which scientific evidence may influence the direction in the future. In the past, I think scientific evidence had quite an impact, and the Enlightenment undoubtedly had huge impact. But as we look to the future, if you take your French farmer there with the hugely expensive steaks, clearly to get what looked like basically, well, any European breed, to get a lot of fat in it, they're either going to be very old or have grains stuffed into them to get the marbling, if you like. So to what extent are people going to be concerned about two things there? You could argue feeding to ruminants what humans themselves can digest as we look to the future is immoral. The beauty of a ruminant animal, it can digest cellulose and turn cellulose into protein. And those French cattle were clearly being fed grain that we could, human beings, could easily consume. The second thing is that to get that level of marbling and to get the age, to get the fat, you will have far more methane emissions associated with that, because the efficiency of deposition of fatty tissue, it's far less efficient. You'll get far more methane emissions, and what's more, if you're doing it through the age of the animal, you've got all the maintenance emissions going on for a far greater period of time. To what extent, therefore, do people say they care about climate change, but when it comes to the reality, they don't give a shit? That if the steak tastes good, that's all they care about, even if it has twice the level of emissions, which I would say that French product probably has 3 times the level of methane emissions compared to, say, New Zealand grass-fed beef. So what do you think is going to happen there?
I love that. And I think, I'm not sure if you were here when I very first started, but one of the things I said is that people are deeply No, I don't mind, but people are deeply contradictory. And not just at the individual person level, but also at the group level. And so what we see is this rise of concern about climate change. But we're also using far more plastic than we've ever used. We're using fertilizer that comes as a byproduct of the natural gas production and so on. So people are contradictory. I would come back and say that I think what is going to happen here is that and I also talked about local versus global, and I think that there are some of those things that play out as well. So if you're sitting in France and you've got your own restaurant and you've got your own cows, people go for the local experience. The fact that they also drove there, possibly in a combustion vehicle, to get to the special restaurant, at that point, pleasure trumps other concerns. Do you get this? And this is why I have this bit of a plea for hedonism, right? On the other hand, what we see is we have seen more scientific information available in the public than ever before. People are completely baffled by what is nutritional information, whether it's good nutrition or bad nutrition, or should I do it. And I think in some ways what we're seeing is people are swimming in a sea of science that some of them don't understand, but they want more of. And at the same time, we're seeing this backlash against science, that all science is bad, you're making Franken food, So I still believe that the future will have those contradictions in it. The important bit for us will be to own the narratives about our own product and know that they're authentic. And so, and I was saying kind of earlier that, I'm a bit dubious about nutrition claims because people still eat donuts, right, and all of that other stuff, no matter how often you survey them about nutrition. I also have some concerns in the future about protein being the next sugar. So, a lot of countries, ours included, eat more protein than our bodies probably need. And other than things like these pandemics, the largest deaths, sort of causes of death we see are often overconsumption of food. So, so human beings are contradictory. You might read all that nutrition data, but does it flow through to, there's a scone out here, shall I have it? I know it's a very long answer, but I think we have to do the best we can, and we have to tell the stories we can. And I believe, like, stacking of those attributes, outdoor grown and grass-fed, I think is an attribute that we can really own. And the thing about all of that, if you look in the US, which is where I trained, feeding all of that grain to cattle has meant that antibiotic use has to go through the roof because the rumen isn't designed for that grain, and so you then have to treat the diseases of the animal because of the food you've given it. And I think that we can tell some of that narrative in a slightly better way. So not only is that grain food that could have gone to humans, but it's also food that wasn't designed for these animals. And I think we can tell a really great story about, the way nature intended. And that's where I think some of this heritage needs to come into the way we tell our story. So I know I can only kind of do a short version there, but thank you so much. And, all of you, thank you, because you underpin our sector. Without you, our sector can't make the kind of changes that it needs to make. So I'm done, but I just want to thank you also for what you do. So have a great day. I'm going to be hanging around. All right.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Melissa.